This red-eyed fruit fly has the dominant phenotype because the mutation sepia is recessive. But is that fly homozygous for the dominant allele or heterozygous? We know it must have one because it has the dominant phenotype. But heterozygotes with only one dominant allele also have the same phenotype as homozygous dominant individuals. Well, with flies, they have a lot of offspring. Obviously, we can control matings, all right? So let's say that we mate this fly to this fly, and given the number of offspring that they have and the controlling of matings, we could say, oh, look at all of your, the offspring with red eyes. So if this individual was a heterozygote, half of their offspring would have had the sepia condition. And so we can control matings with flies and thus determine whether this individual is heterozygous or homozygous dominant. That is what is known as a test cross. So in a test cross, one could then say, I'm going to determine the genotype of this individual with the dominant phenotype. If this individual has a dominant phenotype, I'm going to mate them to someone who is homozygous recessive, and then I will figure out what their genotype is. Because if this individual is homozygous dominant, then all of their offspring will have the dominant phenotype. All right. If this individual is heterozygous, then half of their offspring get the recessive allele and then would have the recessive phenotype. So this is what is known as a test cross. And if you have fruit flies, or if you are working on specific breeds of racehorse or cattle or something, then that can certainly be managed. But obviously we're being silly, because obviously humans, we're not going to start families and have children just to determine the genotype of someone with a dominant phenotype. And so what a genetic counselor would do, if they're looking at a family and disease incidence in the family for some reason, one of the first things they would do is to draw up a pedigree. So they would look at, okay, so here are the parents will indicate males with a square and females with a circle. This then would be their offspring. And let's say in this case, I'm going to shade the recessive condition in with yellow. Well, if the father and mother both have the yellow condition, and then all of the children have the yellow condition, well, this is rather easy, because the only way to have the recessive phenotype is to have a genotype which is homozygous recessive. So all of these individuals, let's say we pick a letter A, all of these individuals I could represent by little a, little a, little a, little a, etc. So that was easy. If, however, the individuals all have the dominant phenotype, well, this is trickier, because if they were homozygous dominant, this is, they would have this phenotype. If they were heterozygous, they would have this phenotype. One doesn't know. And maybe one wants to know, not for something silly like, can you roll your tongue or not? Might I pass a recessive allele on to my children? Well, who cares? But if this is a genetic disorder, right? I mean, certain disorders, they're potentially fatal to children. Some are definitely fatal to children. And so there's a big difference between being homozygous dominant, in which case none of your children would have a genetic disease, versus being a heterozygote. And if your partner was a heterozygote, a quarter of your children could have a genetic disease, which might be fatal. There's a huge difference. And so we might want to know what the phenotype is. Now, there could be a genetic test, but maybe that costs money. And so maybe the genetic test would be the second step. We would first do a pedigree and figure out if there's anyone whose genotype we could ascertain without a genetic test, and then just pay for those that could not be resolved this way. And so we could now, instead of, we'll make this fly to this fly, if we're talking about humans, we would then draw up a pedigree. And here I'm going to represent the individuals with the recessive phenotype with yellow, and with the dominant phenotype with blue. So here, this individual is clearly going to have two recessive alleles, because that's the only way that you would have the recessive condition. So this individual would be little a, little a. Now, what is then the genotype of the other ones? Well, because all of these individuals are blue, we know that they have a dominant allele. That's what gives them the dominant phenotype. These individuals, we know that they have to have a recessive allele, because look at their father. Their father is homozygous recessive. He would only have recessive alleles in the sperm, which contribute to their genetic, all of their genome. And so all of these individuals had to have gotten their dominant blue allele from their mother and their recessive A allele from their father. So even though these individuals have the dominant phenotype, we know what their genotype is by looking around at other individuals in their family tree. Because they have a parent who is homozygous recessive, they had to have gotten a recessive allele from this parent, so all of these are heterozygous. This individual we still don't know, and so we would write big A question mark. Now, the more children that they have with a dominant phenotype, the more we have confidence that they are homozygous dominant. But for example, is it possible for a family to have, say, 4 daughters and then finally a son? Of course it is. Even though it's a 50-50 chance at each birth. And so if it was a 50-50 chance, if this one was a heterozygote of having a dominant phenotype child versus a recessive phenotype child, they could just by random chance get 4 dominants in a row before getting their first recessive, just like you could get 4 daughters before getting a son. And so therefore, we would indicate this person was a question mark. And once again, if we really needed to know, now the only person who would then perhaps get a genetic test would be this one, because everyone else we do know what their genotype is. So this is the reason for pedigree analysis, that you can determine the genotype of some of the heterozygotes just by looking at who their family members are. So here's another example. Let's say that here you have these 2 parents, clearly with a dominant allele, and here are their children. Well, this child has the recessive trait. The only way to have the recessive phenotype is to receive a recessive allele from each of your parents. So if this one got a recessive allele from their father and a recessive allele from their mother, that means that their father and mother must both be heterozygotes. There is no way that this child could get 2 recessive alleles unless each of the parents had one to give. So once again, we would have written these individuals as big A question mark, but now that we know that they have a child with a recessive disorder, we just by looking at their relatives in the pedigree know what their genotype is. They are heterozygotes. Now, these individuals could have gotten, so let's say that all of them get their dominant allele, say from their mother. Let's just make it simple. So all of these 3 dominant alleles came from the mother. So what did this child get from their father? Well, they could have gotten the big A, or they could have gotten a little a. Either way, they would have the dominant phenotype. Now, some of my students have been in the past say, oh, I know Mendelian genetics, so we'll give this one a big A, then we'll give these 2 little a's. It's a 1-to-2 to 1 genotype ratio. Yes, statistically, one would predict that. But once again, just like if you had 4 children, it isn't a hard and fast rule. There will definitely be 2 daughters and definitely be 2 sons. That's just on average. And you don't want to assign this person a genotype they don't have, because this person might be considering, say, a genetic test, or considering whether or not to have a family based on the genes that they have and the diseases potential which run in their family. I'm using an extreme example, but one that one might seek out the advice from a genetic counselor to help address. And so you don't want to say, oh, statistically, you're probably a big A, you're probably a big A, little a. You're telling this individual what their likelihood is that they can pass disease down to the next generation. And so the only thing that you could then do is to say all of these individuals are big A question mark. Once again, if you could do a genetic test, well then, maybe then the insurance company now pays for, only those 3 individuals, but not the parents. Now we know the parents. Once again, we're trying to figure out more based, the genotype of these individuals with the dominant phenotype based on their relatives. So once again, if you had a more complex pedigree, where you have 2 sets of grandparents, then parents, and then the parents' siblings, and then the children. So obviously, anyone with the dominant phenotype has at least one dominant allele. So we give everyone who's blue a big A. Everyone who's yellow, the only way to have the recessive condition is to have 2 recessive alleles. So we give them 2 little a's. And then the question is, can we go through the family tree and ascertain any of these other individuals with the dominant phenotype? Can we, determine with certainty what their offspring would be? Well, some of them. So, for example, this man had 2 children who were homozygous recessive, receiving a recessive allele from each parent. The only way that you can be homozygous recessive is if each parent gives you a recessive allele. This man must have had a recessive allele to give, so he must be a heterozygote. This couple has a son, which is homozygous recessive. This son got a recessive allele from each parent. That must mean that each of the parents has a recessive allele to give. So, because these individuals have a child with the recessive condition, and this individual has a child with a recessive condition, we know that they are heterozygous. What about this individual, what about this individual and this individual? Well, now notice their mother is homozygous recessive. All of her ova would have a recessive allele. So they had to get a recessive allele from their mother. She has nothing else to give. So if one of your parents is homozygous recessive and you have the dominant condition, you must be a heterozygote, having received a recessive allele from each parent. So we know the genotypes now of everyone here. Now, these individuals, if they don't have children, we're going to have to say that we're not sure, because let's say that these dominant alleles came from, say, the mother. Well, then this other allele came from the father. They could have gotten the dominant or the recessive allele. If these dominant alleles had come from the father, the same thing. They could get a dominant or a recessive allele from their mother. They could be homozygous dominant. They could be heterozygotes. We don't know. Now, looking at the last generation here, once again, here we have a child who is homozygous recessive. The only way this child could be homozygous recessive with 2 parents with the dominant phenotype is if each of these parents then gave the child a recessive allele. And so then these 2 parents, they must be heterozygotes, because the only way that this daughter could get a recessive allele from each parent is if each of the parents had a recessive allele to give. But now that we know that they're heterozygotes, we don't know which of their 2 alleles they passed on to the other 3 children. Obviously, these other 3 children did get a dominant allele from one of the 2 parents, but what they received from the other parent, it could be a dominant allele or a recessive allele. All right, and so this is what's known as pedigree analysis. Once again, if we were to have a simple genetics class, I often start off with very simple traits. So, for example, if you can roll your tongue, that's a dominant trait. You have 1 dominant allele. You don't know if you have 2. If you can't roll your tongue, then you have 2 recessive alleles. If you have a widow's peak, which I don't, you have a V in your hairline, you have at least one dominant allele. If you have a straight hairline, you have two recessive alleles. If your earlobes hang free, any part of them, then you have a dominant allele. If they're attached, then you have two recessive alleles. If you have any hair on your mid digits, you have a dominant allele. If you have no hair on any digit, then you have two recessive alleles. So in my classes, we would just kind of start off with these, silly traits, and who cares? And I actually then ask my students, go interview family members, ask them, can you roll your tongue? What does your earlobe look like? Do you have hair on your digits? And then draw your family tree. Because at some point it's interesting, like, what makes me who I am is the programming in form of, DNA and its genes that I received from my parents, who got it from their parents, passed down generation after generation. It's kind of neat to actually see that, your own pedigree. But the reason to do this would be, quite often a genetic counselor sitting down with a family where there's a problem. There's a disease in their family, and this is now, causing them to have, questions about, what testing they should get, what treatments, they might employ. They might even be making family planning decisions based on the results. And so this then could be, quite serious and quite important, the interpretation of these pedigrees.